Hi guys, George here, and welcome back to Film Journal for another exciting installment of a segment I like to call Down the Starlog Rabbit Hole. Starlog magazine was the premier science fiction and fantasy fan magazine of the 1970s and 80s. If you were a fan of Star Trek, Star Wars, or science fiction films of yesteryear, this was the magazine for you. They featured great interviews with directors, illustrators, writers, as well as wonderful articles about things that would be of general interest to science fiction, fantasy, and movie fans, special effects, etc. It's really a cool magazine, and it's a great resource for historians like us today because there's all sorts of great, interesting articles and tidbits in here that I think would otherwise be lost to time unless we track them down in this magazine. So oftentimes, I find an article or some kind of piece of information that I find really interesting, and it sends me down what I like to call the Starlog rabbit hole of doing some extra research and digging to elucidate lots of what would otherwise be sort of forgotten facts, ideas, movies, etc. Should be a lot of fun. Let's get moving. So I'm reading the opening pages of the magazine, an issue from 1981, the communications pages, which is talking about the release of Lucasfilm's new book, the Jedi Master's Quiz Book. 425 cosmic questions and answers about Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. Okay, very cool. But really the interesting thing about this book is that it was written by an 11-year-old. A guy named Rusty Miller, the hero of our segment here. He was a sort of precocious and smart 11-year-old kid who was a Lord of the Rings fan. He had a dachshund named Frodo. And there was a published quiz book on Lord of the Rings, and so he decided, why not do it for my favorite series of films in 1980, Star Wars. And his parents were sort of impressed, and they reached out to Del Rey, which was the imprint of Ballantine that published all the Star Wars paperbacks, the novelization of the movie, the Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the Han Solo series, and they were initially shuffled off. Lucasfilm was in the process of moving to Skywalker Ranch at the time, and they really couldn't be bothered. But fortunately for little Rusty, George Lucas heard about the project, was really enamored of it, and the fact that a young kid had written the book, and so it was published. And Rusty Miller, at 11 years old, became a New York Times best-selling author. So I wanted to do a little more digging into our friend Rusty here, and, you know, for the most part, he's sort of faded into normalcy. He works for the CDC. He's got a kid of his own, hasn't published a book since, but he was interviewed on a podcast a few years back called Skywalking Through Neverland, which is a rather earnest Disney adult podcast about Disney and Star Wars. And
Rusty, who goes by Matthew, is here with us to answer our questions now.
Hey, Matthew!
Well, hello.
We found you!
Yay!
Repeat, we found you!
And they had a somewhat interesting conversation with the grown-up Rusty, who talked about the experience of publishing the book, how when Return of the Jedi came around, the sort of shine was off of him as a now 14-year-old to publish a follow-up Return of the Jedi book. But he did talk about a really exciting phone conversation that he was able to have with George Lucas, albeit brief, where he reaffirmed the kid and said, hey, nice job, Rusty. And I actually tracked down the book, and it's kind of fun, and I'll read you a few questions here, see what you can figure out. How did Han come to possess the Millennium Falcon? Well, he won it in a game of sabacc against Lando, right? Now, the one thing that should be noted here is that there are two questions that are wrong, Rusty. There's a question about who confronts Han Solo in the Cantina bar on behalf of Jabba. And if you look in the back, rather than saying Greedo, it says Snaggletooth. So what a f***ing joke. Disgusting. Really. Pathetic. So here's one of my favorite issues of the magazine that I owned. It's Starlog number 54 from January of 1982. It was the special 3D issue. And you could actually mail away and get some 3D glasses because there's lots of fun to be had throughout the issue. It featured a wide-ranging spotlight on the history and reemergence of 3D or stereoscopic movies in the early 80s. It even features some fun interactive pages, this cool segment of behind-the-scenes stills in 3D if you have the glasses, which I do. Starlog was anticipating a revival of the 1950s 3D craze, a boom that turned out to be much more robust than what actually ended up happening in the 80s. The immediate spark for a renewed interest came from the recent hit Comin' At Ya, a reportedly terrible Spanish import packed with in-your-face 3D gags about once a minute. Despite its quality, it was a huge box office success and convinced Hollywood there might be money in a 3D revival. Although major studios toyed with lots of 3D releases, Friday the 13th 3D in '82, Jaws 3D, Amityville 3D, and Metal Storm, the Destruction of Jared Sin all came out the year after, but the fad quickly faded. David Everett's really insightful and interesting article, 3D The Second Coming, interviews a group of American filmmakers who are taking up the banner of 3D into the future. Most interestingly, based on his quotes, a name really stood out to me. A guy named Earl Owensby, who was working on a 3D feature called Rottweiler.
This latest film, not yet released, is called Rottweiler. Owensby's biggest budget to date, $1 million. Earl is the sheriff in a small town. A pack of killer Rottweilers escape from a top-secret military project and start snacking on the townsfolk. What makes Rottweiler truly special is it is being filmed in 3D, the effect of which is to make the dreaded dogs leap right into your lap. Nobody's filmed in 3D in 25 years in this country. That and a budget 3 times his normal $400,000 might indicate that Owensby is taking an uncharted risk.
Owensby himself was a colorful figure. He had already made headlines in '81 with an eye-catching 60 Minutes interview that featured his breakout hit Challenger, a thinly veiled, Walking Tall knockoff that starred Owensby. He wrote, produced, and directed.
100,000 square feet of sound stages. Unlike most producers, he does not rent a single thing. He buys it all for cash. And the cranes, the lights, everything gets rented out when he's not in production. There's a full-time staff of 40. And instead of putting out-of-town talent up in neighboring motels, he built his own motel. There are 2 planes. One for the corporate Owensby, and the other plane for the stunt-flying actor Owensby. In the middle of it all is a big, comfortable home that also doubles as a movie set. And of course, his private runway is just outside the front door.
The 60 Minutes video is really cool, and I wish there was more available pictures and information on Owensby and his crusade to make North Carolina into a sort of hub for Hollywood.
Some call him the king of the bees, others a genius. Some even say he's just a good old country boy. I've even heard some people say he's one of the 7 wonders of the Carolinas. Well, however one refers to Earl Owensby, one thing is for sure, this guy can make some movies.
And because of his success, the town of Shelby is known worldwide.
He actually ended up buying a giant abandoned nuclear power plant and turning it into what he wanted to be the largest filmable water tank in America, which I believe it was. And as Owensby started to decline, his studio started to decline in the late 80s, he actually rented it out to James Cameron, who used it for the underwater scenes in The Abyss. Owensby is still around, though he's not making movies anymore. I read an article from a local newspaper in North Carolina that said that they were thinking about selling his studio and turning it into an animal shelter. But Owensby himself, as recently as 2021, claimed that he did have people from Hollywood who were knocking on his door to use his studio, but that COVID had kind of, put the kibosh on it. Anyway, Owensby was a super interesting guy, an independent till the end, and just a real cool dude. If anybody knows Owensby, I would really love to reach out and interview him and really do a video on all of his movies, which are hard to find. I would love to watch Rottweiler in the original 3D. So if you guys have any leads, let me know. So I was reading through issue 39, cover story of Buck Rogers, and in the opening pages, there's an article on the disappearing profits from Alien. So Alien, of course, is a film about a corporation who attempts to sacrifice the entire crew of one of its spacefaring vessels in order to ferry a biological weapon back to Earth. I think you've probably seen it. It was a huge hit. It made $100 million on a budget of $12 million.
Are you sorry, sir, that you brought your son along to see Alien?
No, ma'am. I think he should have seen it. It's something that he needs to know, that things like that could happen in life. That could be a true story based on, science. We never know what's going on the outside of the world.
Did the movie scare you at all?
Yes, ma'am, it did.
Well, in this article from Starlog, which heavily sources a Washington Post article from the time, Fox was claiming that it didn't turn a profit and that they had spent way too much money on making prints and advertising that it turned out not to be a hit, which the producers and writers found to be very dubious. So in the article, actually, co-writer Ron Shusett was quoted as saying, "If this isn't a successful film, what is? I can't expect to have a bigger success than Alien. Here I hit the jackpot and haven't seen any money." And according to Tom Pollock, the lawyer for both Ridley and producer Walter Hill, quoted as saying, "I'm not prepared to say whether this is a mistake or outright fraud. One can't say until one audits, but I will say this is the worst case of its kind I have ever seen, ever." So the article ends there, but I did a little more digging and found out that Walter Hill, the producer, and his production company Brandywine, along with Ridley Scott, did sue and were paid out in an undisclosed sum in 1983. So obviously Alien was a huge hit, but if you ever noticed, they didn't produce a sequel for 7 years until James Cameron made Aliens in 86. That was because of this massive lawsuit. They would not start work on a sequel, even though Fox wanted to, until the money situation was resolved. What of Shusett and O'Bannon, the writers of the story? Did they ever get paid? No, they never received their alleged promised back-end payout, but they did go on to have successful careers. Obviously, O'Bannon made Return of the Living Dead, and he has credits on all sorts of other science fiction films, and Shusett, got credit for 1990s Total Recall, a favorite movie of mine. Let me know, guys, if you'd like me to do a video on that. I think that'd be a lot of fun. But yeah, they never really spoke too much about the issue either, which I'm assuming is they didn't want to bite the hand that fed them. They were kind of stuck in the terrible game of Hollywood fake funny accounting, which recently struck movies like 2004's Goblet of Fire, the Harry Potter film. Warner Brothers tried to claim they didn't make any money on that either, which I guess begs the question, why would you keep producing sequels if that was the case? But, oh well, hooray for Hollywood. Too bad. Actually, I read another article from the LA Times. Sigourney Weaver actually sued Fox again in 1990 over a dispute on back-end profits, of which she was promised 10% from Aliens. So, Fox, boy, I don't know. Apparently at the time, in the late 70s, they had been eating a lot of failures. Even though they had once-in-a-generation profit bonanzas with Star Wars and Alien, movies like The Wiz and The Other Side of Midnight were just such drastic bombs that there was a big shakeup at the studio. And, of course, Alan Ladd Jr., that was when he ultimately left the studio to go to the Ladd Company to produce such greats as Blade Runner. So, interesting article. I'm glad I read about it in the pages of Starlog and then was able to go down the rabbit hole and learn more. Isn't this fun? Well, guys, to cap off our episode here, I'd like to talk about Star Trek The Motion Picture, which was an item of curiosity going as far back as issue 1 of Starlog. So I said in the first installment of this video, which you can watch on this channel, that Starlog magazine, the real genesis of it, was as a fan magazine primarily about Star Trek. People were pumped. And if you know anything about the history of Star Trek from TV to screen, it was basically this. The show garnered some more success when it went into syndication, and a whole new generation, I guess, or so of fans was activated, and they were whipped into a fervor of like never before seen fan activism that had petitioned Paramount for years with the rise of these crazy things called conventions, which no one had ever heard of before. So after a decade of this, really, and the production of a cartoon series, Paramount decided that maybe there was some money yet to be wrung from the fan enthusiasm around Star Trek. A movie was considered in the early 70s, but nobody could ever really come up with a story. And Gene Roddenberry was sticking his nose in and would never really approve anything. And the trajectory of the movie was charted through almost every issue of Starlog. You know, it was going to become a show on Paramount's fourth network, a show called Phase 2, and then that was scuttled, and it was decided after the success of Star Wars that yes, indeed, we will make a Star Trek movie, a major motion picture directed by Robert Wise with a gigantic budget of upwards of $40 million. Starting in issue 6, Susan Sackett, the assistant to Gene Roddenberry, decided that she would be charting the production of this movie, which I don't think the anticipation for it was matched until maybe The Phantom Menace in 1999. I mean, people were pumped to see Star Trek come back. And that was, I would say, almost the motivating force of the entire magazine. Every issue, from issue 6 on until the release of the movie, there was an article from Susan Sackett updating fans on the production, the process of hiring writers, whether or not the stars were going to come back, when the movie was going to come out, what was it going to be about. So it's really interesting because Starlog is our only contemporary account of what fans thought about the movie after it came out. And for the most part, not so good. It was very much like Phantom Menace. So we have issue 30, which is the really big Star Trek, the motion picture movie is coming out issue that celebrates the release of the movie with interviews with director Robert Wise, amongst others, and it's just like a full court press of Star Trek hype. But then we have Starlog number 33 with a Saturn III cover issue, and it's what I would call like the fallout. The letters to the editor page is dismal. There were some positive notes for sure. Alan Skeens from Charlotte, North Carolina said, "I am sure that Star Wars and its sequel combined cannot compete with Star Trek the Motion Picture." Dorothy Valdez from Nebraska City said, "I waited in freezing weather to see Star Trek the Motion Picture, and it was well worth the wait. The actors, music, and special effects were excellent." The pro side, I think, dishes out a fair amount of copium. It's not that Star Trek the Motion Picture is a bad movie, but I think we know it wasn't the movie that people were eagerly awaiting for over 10 years. Letha Longley from Utica said, "For some reason, the film turned out boring. How I hate to admit the so long-awaited movie was a dismal letdown. I felt cheated. Where was the interaction of our beloved crew? They were gloriously brought together with these fantastic scenes and settings. For what? I fear the end of a good friend is near. The death of our Star Trek is at hand. It was killed by its own creator." Alan B. Urey from Wilmette, Illinois said, "I must hope it shows a substantial profit so that Paramount will have the desire to produce a sequel which, if they have any sense left at all, will focus on the characters we're paying to see and jettison the over-elaborate special effects we could have done very well without." Shirley Passman from Acton, Massachusetts said, "After having spent 2 excited hours in line yesterday to see Star Trek, I can only say I think Paramount has finally figured out a way to kill the series. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go peel the Star Trek Lives bumper sticker off my car." And we get a really hardcore review from sort of friend of the magazine, writer of Boy and His Dog, Harlan Ellison, who just excoriates the picture. "It is not that Star Trek the Motion Picture is a bad film. It isn't. Clearly, it is also not a good film. The saddening reality is simply that it is a dull film, an often boring film, a stultifyingly predictable film. The timid creation that crawled across premiere movie screens on December 7th, somehow appropriately on the 38th anniversary of another great tragedy, deserves little more than regrets and a weary shake of the head. Yet after the Hollywood press screening I attended last night at the Motion Picture Academy Theater, I saw disappointment that sloped well over into animosity on the part of those who could only benefit from the film doing well. One young person was heard to say, 'I waited 10 years for this?' It was obvious this was not the dream they'd expected." So Sackett actually released a book in 1980 called The Making of Star Trek the Motion Picture, which was largely based on all of her reconnaissance from the set. A lot of it was in Starlog magazine for, 3 or 4 years, and it's really kind of compiled here in this fun book. Actually, it's a nice book. It's got lots of great full-color photos and great insights and little tidbits on the making of the movie, which I am sort of interested in. I guess I don't love the movie exactly, but I'm very interested by the movie, and this is a used copy, right? But if you look closely here, I'll zoom in. It came with a little bookmark included from the previous owner, which is a newspaper clipping of Richard Hatch from Battlestar Galactica, which is sort of fitting for the theme of the show, and I'm sure the person who owned this book was a Starlog subscriber. I think that Starlog magazine went through a real shift after the release of Star Trek the Motion Picture because there's a real quaintness to a lot of the early issues where this is just primarily a fan magazine where they just want to see Star Trek come back, and a huge demarcation point, not just in the industry of Hollywood where genre films and fantasy and science fiction just skyrocketed in the 80s after Star Wars, but the magazine really changes too. It became a lot more commercial. It was seen by Hollywood as a large vector to reach the fans they were looking for, and so it became a lot more commercial. Still appealing, still interesting, definitely, but there's something special and charming about those early issues and the fan anticipation for Star Trek The Motion Picture, which I'm not the biggest Star Trek fan, right? But I do appreciate the movies, and I could see how fans would be disappointed. But hey, guys, thanks so much for watching. This has been a lot of fun. I hope to do more episodes like this. I love talking about Starlog magazine, love reading through it. It's so much fun to find some of these weird tidbits and oddball stories, and I hope you check out the first episode I did a year or so back. So thanks again, as always, for watching the channel. Your likes and subscriptions and comments are really appreciated as it grows. It's been really exciting to see. So thanks so much for tuning in on this sort of casual, fun episode, and I'll see you next time.